Good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to Tipp City High School and the Center for the Performing Arts. Thank you, students, for coming down. You guys know what I expect out of you. I don't expect anything less than the best, and that's what I'm going to get. So good job, guys. Welcome to our guests. At this point, I'd like to introduce Drew Witcherman from the Tipp City Public Library.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Barnes. As Mr. Barnes said, my name is Drew Wichterman. I'm the Assistant Director, Adult Services Librarian at the Tipp City Public Library. Before I have the honor of introducing our distinguished guests, there are several organizations and individuals who made this event possible. A project of this magnitude requires dozens of hours of planning to develop the program you see before you. The people and organizations who must be thanked provided this project with their time, their funding, and their talents. The Tipp City Public Library and I are forever in your debt. Please hold your applause until the end. First, I want to thank Mr. Barnes and Mrs. Scott for their dedication to this project. Next, I want to thank the State Library of Ohio and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Tipp City Foundation, the Tippecanoe Educational Endowment, the Robinson Walters Family Fund, Basim Blunt from WYSO Public Radio Station, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for their financial support and in-kind donations. To our program partners, the St. Paris Public Library, Champaign County Public Library, and the Mechanicsburg Public Library. To the Tipp City Public Library staff for their countless hours spent behind the scenes taking care of every detail. And finally, to Mr. Joe Bellis and to Mr. Randy Sentman. Thank you for all of your hard work preparing the students for this presentation. And now for a little bit about the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. The Dayton Literary Peace Prize honors writers whose work uses the power of literature to foster peace, social justice, and global understanding. Launched in 2006, it is recognized as one of the world's most prestigious literary honors and is the only literary peace prize awarded in the United States. Each year, one fiction and one nonfiction author is awarded a $10,000 cash prize whose work advances peace as a solution to conflict and leads readers to a better understanding of other cultures, peoples, religions, and political points of view. And now to introduce our guests. Our moderator this morning is Loghan Young. Loghan served 4 years of active duty in the Army as a transportation specialist, earning a combat action badge for her 1-year tour in Kabul, Afghanistan. She is currently a program manager at the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And now to introduce our authors. Andrew Krivak is the author of 3 novels, 2 chapbooks of poetry, and 2 works of nonfiction. His 2011 debut novel, The Sojourn, was a National Book Award finalist and a winner for both the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Fiction and the Chautauqua Prize. He followed The Sojourn with The Signal Flame, The Bear, and Like the Appearance of Horses is a forthcoming novel in 2023. His novel, The Bear, received the Banff Mountain Book Prize for Fiction and is a National Endowment for the Arts Big Read title. He holds a B.A. from St. John's College, Annapolis, an MFA in Poetry from Columbia University, an MA in Philosophy from Fordham University, and a PhD in Literary Modernism from Rutgers. Ben Fountain is the author of 3 books and is a former attorney. His first book, Brief Encounters with Che Guevara, won the PEN/Hemingway Award and the Barnes & Noble Discovery Award for fiction. His second book, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, was the winner of the National Critics Circle Award, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up, and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Billy Lynn was adapted into a feature film, and his work has been translated into over 20 languages. His series of essays published in The Guardian on the 2016 U.S. presidential election was nominated by the editors of The Guardian for the Pulitzer Prize in commentary. His latest book, Beautiful Country, Burn Again, is based on these essays. He holds a BA in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a JD Law degree from the Duke University School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Loghan, Andrew, and Ben.
Okay, let's get started with an easy question. So, where did the inspiration to write this book come from for each of your novels?
Well, for me, it came from my grandparents. I didn't know my grandfather. He passed away before I was born, but my grandmother was an ever-present storyteller in my life, and she lived alone at the top of a dead-end street in northeastern Pennsylvania where I grew up. And she had a wood-burning stove in her house, and it was just old Pennsylvania in the 70s. And my mom would go up, and we would just go to her house, and they would have a rye whiskey, and I would have a Coke, and we just listen to stories. And then as I got older, I would prod her more. She spoke Slovak, and so my mom would translate. And then once she passed away, my mom sort of continued telling the stories. And I just knew at one point that I wanted to make something of this in order to come to understand my grandfather, this man who was a presence in my life almost as a, not as a ghost really, but as a story. And so that's what I wanted to make my first novel be.
Yeah, for me, the inspiration for Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk was confusion, bewilderment, perplexity, anger, and specifically directed toward the Afghan and Iraq wars that we embarked on in 2001 and 2003. And by the time I conceived of this book, it was clear that certainly the Iraq invasion had been undertaken under false pretenses. In other words, the American people had been lied to, sold a bill of goods, and the larger issue I felt like was the gap between reality and fantasy that goes on in much of American life that leads us into these situations, and the people who suffer the consequences of that, notably the soldiers who put their lives on the line for bullshit wars. And so that's where Billy Lynn came from, wanting to explore the gap between fantasy and reality in American life.
Great answers. So, each of your characters have a very distinct voice. What is some of the work that you did to develop those voices? And what were the techniques that you enlisted to keep them consistent and realistic?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so for me, I didn't know any World War I veterans in any country, English, American, Austrian. And so I went to the memoir first. Memoirs of World War I. Ben mentioned earlier in another talk about the fact that Vietnam was the first war that we could see on television. You could watch footage of soldiers and Marines and elephant grass and Hueys taking off. And then, of course, now you can see everything on YouTube, on the news. The memoir coming out of World War I, especially English soldiers, officers by and large, who had gone to the great schools of Eton and Harrow, and then they went to Oxford and Cambridge, and they found themselves in the front lines in France. Those are works of nonfiction that are just a gold mine of literature. I read every single one I could find to get a sense of what were these men writing about with respect to war. How did they process it subsequent to the war? And the Sojourn takes place in 1972. It's spoken. It's actually it's 1914, but it's spoken in 1972 from that distance of the years. And so Edmund Blunden has a great book, if you're interested. It's called Undertones of War. I think it's probably the greatest memoir of World War I. I just studied that book and wanted to give Joseph Vinich that voice in that first person. And then, I think just how I wanted to write a sentence, how I wanted to be as a writer, what did I want to leave on the page with respect to a voice. I mean, every writer has his or her own voice, and it's important to know what that is. So those two.
Yeah, for me, it starts with a sound. Like, I have the idea for the story, and it seems like, okay, it needs to sound a certain way. And so that comes from how the words get on the page. I mean, for this situation, these American soldiers who are being honored at this Dallas Cowboys football game, I mean, it's a crazy day for them. It's total sensory overload, and they have people coming at them all day. They're in the middle of this big extravaganza, this huge, football stadium crowded with people, and everybody wants a piece of them. And then there's also, I mean, just the basic complexity of human experience. I mean, at any one moment in our lives, we've also got, our conscious and unconscious sense of the past, that's part of that experience, and our awareness of the future, what might be coming in the midst of present circumstances. And so these guys are having a very intense experience. And so I felt like the sound of it, the sensory experience of reading it should be, as close to overwhelming as I can make it. And so the sentences are crowded with a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff happens. These guys are processing a lot of stimuli. And so I just felt like the sound of it had to be bam, 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 just one thing after another.
Yeah. So both of you kind of dehumanize people in your books. I remember Joseph saying along the lines of, he doesn't remember anything about that man. If he loved anyone, if he had a family, he was the enemy. And Billy kind of speaks about the same way when they ask him, did you kill the guy who killed your friend? And he says, I mean, I'm not sure. That wasn't his intent, was to kill. He doesn't describe, gory details when you walk through the battle scenes. So talk a little bit about the dehumanization. Is that more of like a coping mechanism, you think, or was there something you were trying to illustrate with that?
I mean, that's part of a soldier's training, is desensitive. You know what I mean. Your enemy, they don't become human anymore. And that allows you to engage in this most profound act of killing. I mean, when they specifically ask him in that press conference, did you kill the guy? I think he says, well, I followed my training. Yeah. And yes, he was down. And, he says, okay, I fired and he was down. And then everyone applauds. And that's not the reaction he was expecting, and he doesn't know how to handle it. He said, but I followed my training.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the reading I did once I realized that these Austrian soldiers would be sharpshooters, and that was I needed them to move easily from battle to battle, and sharpshooters were able to do that. I started reading a lot about snipers. And that desensitization,
very good.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, was critical for them to do their job. It's a job at a distance. I mean, one of the longest recorded kills, if you will, in the Austrian army was in the Italian Alps, was 2.4 kilometers away. You don't know who that guy is in the scope. They aim for the teeth because the teeth were bright. They would aim for a cigarette. By 1915, every soldier on the front knew you do not smoke on the line, because the snipers would just, that's what they aimed for. And that precisely, it was a dehumanization. You had to do that. And, the sniper sniper rifle is a weapon of terror in a way. It's an amoral approach to let me back up. It's one army's capacity to break down the morale of another of the enemy, because you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know if he or she is out there, and it instills terror in the other side. And the Germans figure that out really fast. I mean, Winslow Homer has a painting of the sniper in the Civil War. And that's really where, but the sniper goes all the way back to English musketeers. So it's a tradition, that dehumanization. Just have to be there.
I found that very accurate as somebody who's been through basic training and been to a combat zone. The biggest thing that they kept radiating in our minds all throughout basic and just really pounded into us were kids. They were like, these are not children, they're killers. These are not children, they're combatants. And they just kept repeating things like that over and over. And I had a son at the time, and I kept thinking to myself, how am I going to do this when I get over there? How am I going to look at a kid and think combatant? But once you get there, the scene change, and it's almost like you kind of go into costume. You are war ready. Every person is a target and an enemy. There's no such thing as a person. There's no such thing as an animal or a life. These are threats. And so I just found that very accurate. So that really, really stood out to me. And I thought that was really important. You guys highlighted that because I don't think people realize how true that is. Yeah. So were there any stereotypes that you embraced or avoided when you wrote these novels?
In Billy Lynn, almost everybody we encounter is in a costume. I mean, there's cheerleaders, the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. They're in there. I mean, everybody calls them uniforms. I mean, you football players out there, you guys are in uniform. You're in a costume. I mean, that's basically what a uniform is. You're in the costume of a football player. And so, I mean, you got the football teams, they're in costume. You've got the cheerleaders, they're in costumes. You've got the military, they're in costumes. They call them uniforms, but they're costumes. You got the fans, they're dressed up in, their Cowboys jerseys. That's a costume. I'm playing a role. You've got the big business guys in the owner's suite. They're wearing their business guy costumes, the Brooks Brothers suits. And so you put on a costume, you assume a role. And you start, I mean, that's part of what you're projecting out into the world. That's my identity. I am this person. I'm playing this role. And so for me, I mean, part of the challenge of writing the book was honoring the cliche, which, I don't know, that's kind of a crazy thing to say because we're taught that cliches are bad things. But, I mean, we live with cliches all day long. But, honoring the cliche, but also digging down beneath it. And to me, like, the hardest moments of the book, the most important moments of the book are when, the human being inside busts through the costume, busts through the cliche. And it leaves people both vulnerable and genuine when that happens. So, yeah, my book is full of cliches.
Yes, it is.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, much more of a distance. I have to say, I was afraid of the stereotype of writing about battle. I was afraid of the blood. I was afraid of describing, the wound, the dead and the wounded in the train station at the border of what is now Slovenia, as the troops came through. And I maybe, this goes back to the dehumanization question, is I worried about having that be too much over the top. And so I had to straddle this line of, in my research, it's what I saw in photographs. It's what photographers at the time were taking pictures of. It's what people would have experienced. And so I tried to eyedropper it in there, just a little bit, not over the top, but make it real. And so it's that balance of what is authentic and what is not. But also wanted it to be, I wanted it to be real, but at the same time, I was always afraid of that. So I hope it was a good balance. I think I wanted the book's in three parts. There's the early years, the war years, and then the traveling year. And so I was really worried about putting too much in the war section and the battle section. And so, it is what it is. But the wicked stepmother is a cliche in my book. But I have to say, according to my grandmother's story, she was real. She was raised by a wicked stepmother who fed her kids and starved my grandmother and her sisters. And so that my grandfather, my grandmother went to him and said, I want to go to America. He said, I've been waiting for you to ask. Here are your papers. He knew it was a bad situation. And my grandfather, when he came home from the war, the first thing his stepmother said to him was, why aren't you dead like the rest of them? So.
Yeah.
there's truth in the cliche.
Agreed. I do think we do live with
Yeah.
cliches and stereotypes every day. It's exactly the vibe I got when I read your book. I was like, oh, typical band of brothers, group of guys, no females in there. I should have expected that, which I did, but I think it brings realism to the book because my husband was military as well. We were dual military. We were both Army veterans. I have a combat action badge. He does not. So our license plate has a combat action badge sticker. And a lot of times they go right up to my husband and say, thank you for your service. And he said, I didn't serve, my wife did. And just to be funny, and they're like, oh, okay. And they just leave. They don't come and say thank you or nothing. So I do think that our life is filled with cliches. So even though both books have male protagonists, both of you chose to include some influential female characters who affect the main characters. So could you talk about the female characters a little bit? How important were they to your stories?
Yeah, so two characters. Joseph's mother appears through dreams. She's died when he was a baby, so he doesn't have any memory of her at all. But he evokes her in dream sequences at various points along the way, and she's something of a, she does direct him at times when he needs direction, and it's just seemed to me important that that his mother, that woman would persist throughout the novel. And the dream, I've spoken before, you have to be careful with dreams in novels. They can be a cliche. But I still wanted to use that. It's important to me. And then Joseph in his walk back to his home encounters a Romani woman who had her own war, her own personal war. And he saves her from being accosted by two Honved soldiers. He saves her and protects her. She's pregnant from a bad situation. She stepped outside of the Romani culture and had an affair with a Hungarian officer, as the story is told. And he goes off, whether he left her or whether he's killed, it doesn't know. So now she's alone in the world, no longer part of her family because she's mahrumeh, which is taboo in Romani. And he's gajo, which is the Roma term for not a Roma. And so, but he's her protector to her moment of death and the birth of her child. And there's a sojourn within the sojourn in which the two of them are at a few months of peace before she gives birth. And it's a love story insofar as the two need each other and love each other for the daily peace and protection that they give each other. And I just wanted to have that be. To me, that was an important element of peace in the novel.
Yeah, I mean, the main characters in Billy Lynn is a squad of soldiers, and they're combat soldiers. And at that point in the war, there were very few, if any, women serving directly in combat roles. And so it's an all-male squad. So it's 8 guys. And there are not a whole lot of pages there for women. And I'm making it up to you, though, with this next novel, 2 out of the 3 main characters are women. So
I'll get that title.
okay, yeah. So it's not me being lazy and trying to avoid writing about women. It's the nature of the beast. But I mean, there are 3 women: mother, sister, lover. I mean, there's Billy's sister, Catherine, and she's had her own crisis. She's been in a car accident, and so she's been snapped awake to the realities of the world. And she and Billy have that in common. There's Billy's mother. All right, mom. Moms are tired. Moms have to do so much, and she's trying to hold the family together. And so mom is weary, and she's worried. And then the lover. All right, what a cop-out it would be if I wrote this book about these soldiers as guests of honor at a Dallas Cowboys football game and I didn't have the cheerleaders. I mean, you've got to do it. You've got to go there one way or the other. And because they're so iconic, it's just, you know, a pure strain of Americana. And so, you know, for me to do the material justice, I got to go there. And I thought, well, Billy is going to have some kind of an encounter with a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader. And how in the hell am I going to do that? In a way that's genuine, but also honors the cliche. But they do have a couple of encounters, and it's a powerful, I mean, a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader, if you are a heterosexual male American guy, I mean, you're aware of the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, and that's a powerful thing in your psyche. And so to, you know, have a flesh and blood encounter with a creature like this, you know, it needs to be a powerful moment in the book. And so, you know, I leave that to the reader to judge as to whether I got there.
Is that the same sort of thing you did with including Hilary Swank, sort of the cliche or the irony? Why
Well,
inject her?
Well, that's about the movie business, and the movie business is nuts. And I based that on an earlier thing I'd written, and the lead character is male. And so these producers came to me and they said, well, we want to do your story, we want to make it into a movie, but we've got Hilary Swank to play the lead role. And I'm like, well, the lead role's a guy. They said, don't worry, she can play guys. And but actually, in the movie where she played a guy, she was a girl playing a guy.
Yeah.
And so they said she can play a guy. Anyway, it's very confusing. So anyway, I used that in Billy Lynn.
Oh, okay. So both of your books kind of received acclaim. Well, not kind of, they did. They received acclaim from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. So did you see these books, that you wrote books about peace versus writing about war? Was that intentional?
I didn't think about it intention during the writing, but I did think about the fact that my grandfather had to survive somehow, and I imagined him on the Piave River surrendering, and just thinking, I just want this to be over, and thinking about the entire sweep of World War I and how that was a war that the world thought would lead to everlasting peace, if not everlasting. And so, and then I thought about the balance of war and essentially the trauma of the character in the war, and so following the battle scenes with the travel back to the old country and his time with the Romany woman, I began to think more about the fact that yes, this is a proper balance to war, and these two become, I don't know, I'm just going to say this now, I hadn't thought about this before, but there's a kind of Adam and Eve character to these two in this forest somewhere between Hungary and Slovenia. And then it occurred to me too, as I really wanted to dedicate this book to my mother, Irene, and Irene in Greek means peace. And it just all sort of came together. But intention, to me, it was, I wanted it to be a deeper fabric of what war and peace can mean, should mean. But ultimately, yes, in the end, let's hope for peace.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're writing about soldiers in combat who have been in combat, I mean, there's the thing that's done. You know, there's the battle itself, there's the encounter itself, and that's a worthwhile thing to write about because it's a profound human experience and it happens over and over again. I mean, millions and millions of times. But I think if we're going to have any brains, if the book aspires to have any brains, it's, you know, a half a step after the actual encounter or act is why. Why is this happening? Why are human beings doing this to one another? That's a political question. And so any novel about war, if it's going to be any good, is going to be a political book. And that has to do with who has the power in society, who is making the decisions, and what are the bases for these decisions. And that's where fantasy and reality come in. I think there's so much of fantasy in American life, and there's so much to be gained monetarily and in terms of power by selling a bill of goods to the American people, that it's a powerful incentive. But it does tremendous damage. And I mean, it puts people's lives on the line, and most obviously the soldiers. And so for Billy, the political question is not an abstract thing. It's life and death for him. I mean, he's in this war. It's political, like all wars are political, and he might die. And so it is life and death stakes for him, and that's why he's walking around like he's been shocked into awareness, and he's trying to figure out, why is the world the way it is? You know, what sets of powers and forces have brought me to this point where me, a 19-year-old who has nothing against Iraqi people, I'm over there killing them and trying not to be killed. What is going on in the world that this is happening? So, yeah, war, peace. I mean, it's all balled up together.
Logan, it occurred to me listening to the introduction that the Dayton Literary Peace Prize is also about opening up cultures to us. And both Ben's and my novels, I think the cultures that the novels bring are a big part of it. You know, I was struggling to come to understand my grandfather and my grandmother's life in an empire at the turn of the century. And I put languages in there that few people speak anymore, and didn't translate them, so that cognitive dissonance of not knowing what someone is saying is real. And Billy Lynn's song Halftime Walk is Hamlet, is Shakespeare. Hold the mirror up to your own culture and see that. And also, too, the way you've spoken to us so eloquently about being in Afghanistan and thinking, wow, what a beautiful country, beautiful people, and the stories we've heard about the Afghans you've met. I think that's a really strong component of understanding peace, is understanding culture.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You can't understand what you don't know, which I've just come to realize over time. And I think culture is a huge part of it. I mean, when we go to basic training, we get a cultural background on the Afghans and the local nationals, because the culture is so important. I mean, for example, even though, Americans have female soldiers were not allowed to go to head of villages and speak to any men there. And if they did even accompany, they had to be in a full burqa, regardless if you're a U.S. soldier or not. We had to accommodate those cultures. And something as simple, when we would point, we do what's called the knife hand. You don't point directly because that's extremely offensive and rude and could, trigger a crowd to be really mad at you. So you point like this, you give clear direction, with the knife hand. And it's funny, my kids have taken that up. I saw my son talking to his little brother. He said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Mission accomplished." But I do think culture is very significant, especially with peace. And reading war books, I never, especially someone who's been to war, I didn't think the two went together. I didn't think you could make a war book about peace until I got with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and started reading the suggestions, like book like yours, that I realized that is a theme, because you can't bring peace if you don't know what war brings. And I thought that was exactly what they strive to do. So did did the Peace Prize recognizing you all, did it bring any new revelations or ideas associated with your book that you hadn't considered before?
You have to go.
Okay. Well, I'm glad so many people liked it.
Yeah.
That's a hard one. I mean, one thing I love about being a writer and just I feel like I'm under the radar and I get to write what I want. I feel like I'm able to tell the stories I want, and at the same time, it's nice to be recognized. But I think precisely to that last question is it allows me to realize that, or I guess I should say I had realized that those themes of peace, that understanding war and culture, that's what I'm writing about, and I've accepted that as what I will write about, and to me that's a great thing, not just a good thing. So it's a good question. I feel sort of inarticulate about it.
Yeah, why, if you call it a war novel, why couldn't you call it a peace novel?
Yeah, right.
Why do we call it a war novel instead of a peace novel?
Mm.
So in a way, Billy Lynn has been certified and validated as a peace novel.
Yeah.
It didn't win the prize, but it was a runner-up. So close enough.
You're not first, you're last. So, what advice would you have for future writers who choose to write about war?
Yeah, well, I would say to any writer who wants to write, just to read as much as you possibly can. Read what you love and study it. Why do you love it? Read what you hate and realize why you hate it. And don't write like that. And then just, keep a notebook and be curious and be disciplined insofar as understanding that writing is a craft and it's work, and it's done alone in a room with words. It's not to say everyone has to be a crazy introvert, but it's work, and sometimes it doesn't work out. It doesn't mean the work's over. It's not a one and done. It just means you go back to it. Any athlete out there, you got to do the reps. You just got to keep at it over and over and over again, and it's that 1,000 hours. Is that what they say? 1,000 hours to be good at anything?
10,000.
10. There you go. 10. So, I mean, that's just practical stuff. It's all I would have to offer. Then maybe it could be more.
Yeah, I tell you, it used to be if you sold your soul to corporate America, at least you got something for it. Okay, you had some expectation of job security. If you went with IBM or GE, you could hang around for life. All right, they gave you like health benefits, health insurance. Like that was a no-brainer. Everybody got health insurance, full health insurance. It wasn't even an issue. All right, you got a pension when you retired. So, you worked for GE for 30 years, you retire with full benefits. All right, now you can sell your soul to the corporation and be out on your ass the next week.
Mm-hmm.
So my feeling is, why not do what you want to do?
Yeah.
And so if you want to do some kind of art, whether it's visual art, movies, music, dance, writing, theater, do it. Because if you go to corporate America, you've got no guarantee that they're going to take care of you. I think quite the opposite. So, and having a life in the arts, it's a good way to live because you've got to be paying attention all the time. It's not this kind of stultifying life that so much of corporate America is, where you're going through the motions and it's just dull and you're just waiting to get through the day. I'm sorry to rag on corporate America, but it's the truth, a lot of it. Maybe you can find a satisfying career in corporate America. There are people who do that, but man, there's a lot of bad work out there. But if you're doing art, you've got to be paying attention. You've got to be fully alive and engaged all the time. And if you're going to have a life, you might as well live it.
Yeah, I agree. So you chose to both write a fiction book. However, a lot of your story sounds primarily nonfiction. Why did you choose to write fiction or nonfiction? Well, you both chose to write fiction, but why choose? And how do you decide?
I thought this book would be nonfiction. My first book was a work in nonfiction, a memoir, and I was lucky to, in the writing world, I got an agent, and we sold it and went out with a good publisher. And so I thought that was it. Once you're in that vein, you gotta keep writing nonfiction. So I pitched her this story about my grandfather who fought in the war, World War I, and conscripted and then imprisoned and walked home. And she said, "It sounds to me like you want to write a novel." And I said, "Can I do that?" And she said, "Sure, I'd love to read a novel that you write." And so that gave me the permission, and I did that. And what I loved about it was that I could tell all kinds of lies. There's a great line in a sonnet by John Berryman, a mid-century poet. He says, "Listen, for poets are fain to lie, and I for you a liar am 1,000 times." And there was something constricting about nonfiction. And there's a real, you got to get it right. Look, you got to get the fiction right too. There's a question of authenticity, do your research and everything. But there was just the kind of, these are your characters, they're your people, you can do with them what you want. And I love that kind of freedom. I don't know that I'll ever write nonfiction again. So I like writing fiction novels. I mean, I was talking to Ben about a nonfiction idea I have. I won't bore you with it. It has to do with fishing. But so I think that's it. Fiction became the place where I feel like I felt most at home. Just writing a sentence, to me, if I write one sentence, and it's a good one, that's a great day of writing.
I mean, what changes us, truly? I mean, I think it's rare that arguments actually change minds, change us. And God knows we hear a lot of arguing in the national discourse today, or even in the local discourse. I mean, just, you can find, anything out there. If you twist it hard enough, it can support your point of view. And so I think people have just become hardened. What really changes us are experiences. I mean, things that happen to us in our lives. And I've seen this happen 100 times. Somebody's homophobic, and then it turns out that their sister or mother or father or best friend turned out to be gay. And all of a sudden they have to reevaluate what they thought they believed. And that's an experience. And that kind of thing has the potential to change people. I think there's a better chance in writing fiction of leading the reader to have an experience. It's like when the words are working on the page, it's not an argument, it's not a set of facts, it's not, an abstract, summary of something going on. But if the words are powerful enough, and if the reader is open enough, and at a particular point in his or her life where they're, looking for answers, the right novel or short story can be an experience as opposed to information. And so novels and short stories were the things I liked to read the best. Growing up and as a young adult, I was finding experiences there. And I thought, well, if I get pleasure out of reading this stuff, how much more pleasure might I get by writing it? And so that's part of what led me to be a writer.
Great answers. Thank you both. We're going to open it up to the student audience now. If you all want to line up at this microphone here, and you can ask any questions that you may have for either of the authors.
Hello?
There you go.
There we go. Okay. All right. So, something about this is for Ben. So, something about Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk that really interested me was about how a lot of war books kind of take you through the action. It's about the battles and stuff, but this one, it really is about the social stuff, like stuff that goes on in the brain, the emotional stuff, like the halftime show, things like that. So I was just kind of wondering, like, what inspired you to write it like that, as more an emotional piece rather than a war and combat piece?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of war memoirs out there and plenty of war novels. And again, I mean, what I found myself like perplexed about and bewildered about, and so what I needed to write about was that gap between reality and fantasy. You know, the reality of the soldier's experience versus the fantasy version of that, you know, that mainstream America, you know, has been sold. And I couldn't really do that with the guys over in Iraq. I had to bring them back home and drop them into the middle of America, you know, to really have any chance of getting anywhere, you know, writing about it. So, yeah, it's a weird war novel in that it takes place in the middle of Texas Stadium during a Cowboys football game.
Thank you. My name's Jack. You told me to say my
Yeah.
name, and I totally forgot.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Everybody seems to know you anyway. Yeah.
That's fair.
Hi, this question's for Ben. I'm Issa. What do you believe is the strongest safeguard against future unnecessary wars?
Well, the strongest safeguard against future unnecessary wars is us paying attention. I mean, doing our own thinking, not allowing social media or mass entertainment, you know, the fantasy industrial complex to tell us what to think and feel, but to do everything we can to figure out why the world is the way it is, and, you know, deploying our brains and our own experience and our education toward figuring out what's true and what's false, and then acting on that basis. So, you know, living in reality as opposed to fantasy.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kaliet, and I have a question for you, Mr. Krivak. Your grandfather shows a lot of amazing character traits in the novel, such as bravery when Zlee dies. Are there any character traits you have that reflects Joseph?
Ah,
You guys are heavy hitters.
yeah. I want to believe. I want to believe that he passed down a sense of discipline to my mother, and she passed that along to me. And then also, he was apparently had a really good eye. Like he was a master carpenter, but a really kind man with a slightly explosive temper. And I want to believe that's me as well. But just attention to detail, and I think any novelist would have to have that. So I thank him for that. That's a good question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mia. I also had a question for you, Mr. Krivak. So you said that the story was like inspired by your grandmother. Why did you choose to write her story through the perspective of a male and a teenager?
Yeah. So she passed along the stories of her husband, and then of the men in World War I. So the women stayed home in the village, and she was a girl of 12 or 13 during the war, and so she would hear all these things secondhand. But then when she married John. You know, I don't know what they talked about, but I'm certain he told her enough, because she would pass along his stories, his perspective. And then the teenager, again, this notion of the coming of age, a young person's becoming. So it fascinated me. I wanted to understand how he, at the age of, let's say, 17 in the novel, but you know, he's 18. I have a photograph of him very young on the Piapa River. What was he thinking? What did he went through a lot, you know? If you read, who's read Farewell to Arms, Hemingway's Farewell to Arms? He was on the other side. My mom used to joke that her dad took a shot at Hemingway when he got, and so that precisely wanting to understand the becoming of that young man. How did he survive? Why did he survive? As a result of that, I'm here, and that is the reason. And the first person point of view was essentially, it could only be his point of view. And also that I was reflecting the memoirs of World War I too. Who else could tell that story, you know? So,
Thank you.
yeah.
My name's Briley, and this question is for Ben. Who was the target audience of your book, and what was what did you want them to take away from it?
The target audience, well, I wasn't thinking much about it when I was writing. I was just trying to get the story correct. And really, that's all I can handle. I mean, as far as who I hope would read it, anybody who's looking for some answers, who is bewildered and perplexed like me about why the world is the way it is, why it works the way it does, in ways that lead to, unnecessary wars and people being killed and damaged beyond repair. So anybody who's looking for answers, I don't know if they'll find it in Billy Lynn. Maybe some people will find something, but I tried to write it as genuinely as I could so that if somebody is looking for answers, they might have a chance of finding one or two of those in Billy Lynn.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sadil Mehta, and so my question is, I just want to hear your thoughts, both of you guys. So do you think, through your novels and of course your history and your research about history and war, do you think that in like today's society, peace has really just become preparation for war?
Huh.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, war is big business. War is profit. There's not as much money to be made in peace,
Right?
And so, like, we are constantly on a war footing. I mean, the defense budget is $800 billion, this year, right? Biden's Build Back Better plan, they were talking about, oh, well, it's going to cost $3.5 trillion over 10 years. Well, we're going to get there in 3 years on the so-called defense budget. So yes, everything, all the profit incentive is toward war. And we are on a constant war footing. And believe me, we are at war, some form of war, all over the globe right now. So, yeah, man, always at war.
Yeah, I was 10 years old when my brother was wondering if he was going to ship off to Vietnam. He got pulled a pretty low draft number, and he and my dad, I just remember them sitting in the kitchen talking. I don't know what they were talking about, but I don't think he would come back. And so for me growing up, it was like, okay, so grandfather in World War I, father in World War II, my brother's about to go to Vietnam. That's what you do. It wasn't the case for me, but did you see? I didn't see Ukraine coming. I mean, I'm not a foreign advisor, but probably if I'd read about enough about it. But it just seems like there is always something going on. I mean, I say I missed. The '80s were a pretty quiet time, but then when I was in '91, there was the first Gulf War. I knew guys who joined the Marines. One guy was a Harrier jet pilot there. Another guy was a lieutenant, platoon leader on the ground in the Army. They went to OCS school, and actually I knew 3 guys who enlisted in the Marines. And yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I don't know how well. I don't know.
Thank you. Loved hearing your thoughts.
My name's Evan Liette, and my question was for Mr. Krivak. And I was wondering what was the hardest part in writing your book, and then what was the most fun part of writing your book?
Are you and number 21 brothers?
Yeah, we're twins.
Okay.
We're
All right.
twins.
Got
Hey,
it.
did you just ask me a question?
We thought you just changed your name.
Right.
That's cool. Good. Anyway, the hardest part was always where I wanted to get it right. So I wanted to get the scene. I wanted to get the opening scene right. I felt like I owed it to my grandmother. I wanted to get right where Lee is killed in the roost between snipers. And I also wanted to get Joseph's emotional response right. I had to go back on that a couple of times. But, you can't overdo it, right? And I wanted to get, and like I said before, too, I wanted to get the balance of the of the war, right? I think the most, I'll tell you right now, the best part was writing about when his former sniper commander they come down to Kobarid. The troops, the Austrian army is just broken through. Again, read Farewell to Arms, you'll get the other side of that. And he says, I need you in the Alps. And I started hiking through the Alps. I have a great friend from college who was a mountain guide in Chamonix. And I've been visiting him in Switzerland. We'd go skiing. And so he helped me out on that book. And in my next novel, there's a reverse walk through the mountains, which is meant to mirror the Sojourn. We literally did a virtual tour of every place he would have gone to take his clients on the Haute Route as a guide. I just love that because it took me to a part of the world I had been to, I knew well, I wish I could live in. And for now, I just had to get my guy there in 1918. So that was fun. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. This will be our last question.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie. I was wondering how frequently you both like faced writer's block and like how do you get past that?
Writer's block. Yeah, that's a bad word around our house.
I don't,
I mean, there's different kinds of writers. There are binge writers. Like they'll just go nuts for, 3 or 4 days or a week or a month where it's just they're writing 20 hours a day or whatever. And then there's people who just kind of like you get up in the morning and you give it as many hours of the day and the best hours of the day as you can. And so that's just what you do. You get up and you sit down at the desk, and some days are better than others, but you're writing, you're getting words on the page. And usually the only time I've encountered this terrible thing that you mentioned is when I'm sick and I don't have much energy, or there's too much going on around the house, or there's some kind of outside distraction. So nah, not much.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. It's exactly right. And not only writers having their different styles, but I've gone through that in different phases of my life. With 3 kids, there were weeks where I'd be lucky to get 15 minutes, and I'm just exhausted. And then now I get longer stretches, and so you have to be willing to let yourself be flexible, But also too, I find that 2 things. Whenever I feel like I can't write, I just read, and I find that there's always a kind of oblique way in which another writer's perspective helps me out, helps me to see what I need to do, and it's not imitation at all. It's just like, oh yeah. So that's how I need to get in there. And also, I take a nap. It's really, and there's something about the changing of the brain. And COVID, brought a lot of couples together in the house. So people who work at home normally, and then their spouses don't. I'd work until I'd work in the morning. I'd take the kids to school. I'd come back. I'd get an hour, and 10 o'clock, I'd take a nap. And my wife comes down for her coffee. She's been on Zoom since 7, and she's like, "What are you doing?" I'm just like, "I'm writing." and she knows exactly what I'm talking about, and that's cool. She's fine with that. But the other thing too, I was going to say is, I think there's a patience. I think when you're in it for a long time, you learn to be patient with yourself. Let the rhythms dictate how you're going to be in this next. What's this next book's going to be like? How's it going to unfold? You don't know yet, but you know that you've been in the forest before with the other book, and you know the way out. So. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all. Those were amazing questions. You should have wrote the questions for me. That would have made my job much easier.
Okay, authors, any final thoughts for the students?
Let's see. It is really hard being your age.
Yeah.
It's always been hard. I think it's harder than it's ever been because y'all have so much coming at you and so many expectations. So I have no advice to offer except I feel you. And if it feels like a struggle, I think it's an honest struggle, what you're going through.
Well said.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, we could stay up here and say, be true to yourself and all this stuff, but the fact is you're just in a place where you have so much ahead of you, and precisely because of that, you can't see yet how it's going to shake out, And I would say, don't worry, it's going to be fine. And if you keep doing what you're doing, don't do stupid stuff, and don't let anyone put an obstacle in your way. You're going to be fine, and that includes you. Don't put obstacles in your own way. So, good luck. And also, I think you guys are just brilliant. It's so much fun. It's cool. Thank you.
I just want to add that any of you who are thinking about joining the military, come talk to me first. I'm not going to change your mind. Just going to go back and forth with you.
All right, let's give a round of applause to our panel, please.